to this, and as the title says, this is another vid on UFC 92, and a little bit more in-depth on my problems with it that I talked about. I really wasn't able to talk a lot in-depth with what kind of the problems I had with it that I brought up. And also I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of no Fedor apparently allowed in UFC, but I'll get to that in a minute. That's a little more tongue-in-cheek. But a lot of people kind of questioned what, well, let me state this for people who have not seen that video. I did think UFC 92 was very good. I think it's probably one of the best UFCs they've put on in a very long time. And so a lot of what this is a lot of nitpicking, but I do have a reason for it, and I will hopefully be able to talk about that in this video. And I know a lot of people are going to be like, can you please stop with the MMA videos? The next video will be an actual pro wrestling video, as a lot of people on my last video asked for a seemingly, same time as since it was a TNA rant and then a WWE rant, and I will do that. Probably will not be as fiery because the issues in WWE are a little bit more different, but that will probably be the next video when I can finally kind of get all of that in my head. But let's get talking about this. UFC 92 and kind of my problems with it. Now, I brought up the fact of with them showing the undercard matches, and I think I didn't really get my point across as I wanted to, as I was trying to go too fast, and so I wasn't able to really get what I wanted to say. It's not so much of them putting the undercard matches on the pay-per-view. That is not the problem. The problem I have is still with the pacing of UFC pay-per-views. I don't think that they have a good grasp of the time that they are given, and that they use the undercard matches as kind of a cop-out. And this pay-per-view still ended, what, 20 minutes early? So, which brings up the question, because a lot of people pointed out that, it wouldn't have ended that way. We probably would have got at least one more fight on this card from the undercard if either of those two fights have been any good. So what's going to happen if UFC has the same type of problem and the undercard is complete and utterly horrible and they don't want to show a lot of those fights? Therein starts kind of the problems with this. That I just think they rely too much on there. And it's not that, because like the first comment on my last vid was I'm the only person that would complain about seeing more fights. And it's not so much complaining about seeing more fights as much as I think they can use their time more wisely. That's really my problem. For example, I think that, okay, you have to think, and I don't know, because I don't think anybody on any MMA site, news site I have ever read has ever brought this issue up, and I don't think would ever question a UFC on this, as they don't like questioning UFC on a lot of things, particularly on the business side of things, because UFC is doing so well, but I'll get into that in a minute as well. Because I still think you have to question them on some things. How they set up the pay-per-view as far as time. You have to figure they've got X amount of matches set for the pay-per-view. They figure, you figure you need this much time for each match if each match goes the time limit. So there's your time limit. There's your time for the pay-per-view, and you have it all drawn up on a board or somewhere where there's your time for your pay-per-view. It is not too hard, and I know this is not too hard because we see it in boxing, and particularly HBO boxing, which I brought up before, does a better job of this, where the same types of things happen, where you might get a lot of early matches, or matches that are finished way early, and so you have time to kill. There are better things I think they could do, particularly for the live crowd, and that is really what I was trying to get at, was for the live crowd. Because does the live crowd really want to see a fight that they saw, just an hour ago, or an hour and a half ago, or 2 hours ago? They really want to see that, or would they rather see up on the screens as they're sitting there waiting in between fights a longer promo package? Would they rather see them in the back interviewing guys? Would they rather see them interviewing guys on the fights coming up? Whatever. Would they rather see that? I think most people would, and I also would state that I think they could do better with the promo packages. Since we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of Pride going bye-bye. And with Pride leaving, can you sit there and honestly say that the production values of UFC have gotten any better since then? I would say no. I actually think I think the video packages have actually kind of gotten worse. I don't think they're nearly entertaining. I don't think they do the pay-per-view video packages. I don't think do anything to make you any more excited about the fight than before. And to the point of, I have watched UFC events with friends who are not big UFC MMA fans, and I have watched them particularly with guys who like MMA, enjoy MMA, but are big-time boxing fans, were brought up around boxing, were brought up watching boxing, and they continue, and all of them have basically stated the same types of things over and over and over again, that the production values are very lacking, particularly when you compare them to, again, HBO Sports, and particularly HBO Boxing, which does a much better job. Go back and watch the Pacquiao De La Hoya match. That match seemed like a big freaking deal, and it really didn't add. It didn't have, you know, any WWE type of stuff that like Pride used to have in it, but it still felt like a bigger deal because they treated it like it was a bigger deal. And for whatever reason, UFC refuses to do that with their fights, and I have no idea why. You know, let alone trying to do like what Pride would do, and adding a little bit of showmanship to, you know, the entrances. I'm not saying I'm not saying do like with, you know, pro wrestling crazy, but you could do what, for example, Pride did on a lesser scale, particularly the 2 US shows, which worked. And you know, if you go back and watch those 2 shows, they worked. That part of that show worked. Those were 2 very good shows. The first show, particularly, was much better than it had any right to be, in my opinion. And the second show was extremely good, considering that, you know, a lot of people thought that was going to be their swan song. That was probably going to be the last pay-per-view they ever put on. And they still went out and put on a hell of a show. I mean, as far as a show. And UFC just doesn't want to do that. And I've heard it said that they don't want to do that because they're afraid that if they do that, a lot of the, I don't want to say mainstream media because that's not the right term, but more of the old school journalists are going to, you know, probably the elite sports journalists, which already look down on MMA, are never going to accept MMA because they're just going to say, see, it's just like pro wrestling. Well, guess what? They're never going to accept MMA anyways. If they did, they already would, and they don't. You know, they continually talk about what they don't like about MMA, or they refuse to talk about MMA. MMA needs to take a page from NASCAR. Because you know what? NASCAR truly never really changed anything it ever did. It basically said, this is what we are, this is what we're going to sell ourselves at. Maybe we'll bring in some guys who are a little bit more accepting to America as a large, and not at large, and not just to Southern America. But as far as the show of NASCAR, we're not going to change it that much, and they haven't changed it that much. And guess what? A lot of these guys that refused to cover NASCAR because I said it was a Southern sport and that's all it would ever be, are now forced to do it. So, you know, they really could learn something from NASCAR from that perspective, and the fact that they could make the shows a little bit more entertaining to that extent. From the stuff around, I'm not talking about the matches themselves, I'm talking about the stuff around the matches. That part of the show is where I really think they need to improve on. And like I said, my buddies, I have 3 buddies in particular who, I mean, these guys were from the time they were 3, were watching boxing. So they have seen pretty much everything, and they like MMA. They often say they think that they wish that boxing would learn from MMA, but they often say that, you know, MMA could learn from boxing because they don't do a good enough job of really hyping up their events and really hyping up the card during the card, you know, which again, that affects the live crowd. You don't believe me? Go read people who were at the First Affliction show. One of the things that they all said once they got home and they watched the show on television, said the same thing, that the production crew did a bad job of capturing the live energy that was in that arena. As everybody said, it was a wild, crazy, just fun time, and one of the best MMA experiences they ever had from that perspective. And I would say that Affliction did a better job of putting on a show than what UFC has ever done, in my opinion. So, you know, those are the things that that I was trying to kind of point out. Not the fact that they're putting on more fights. I have no problem with them putting on more fights. I do have a problem with them putting on fights after the main event. I have a big problem with that. I don't think that's a good idea. I think the main event should be the main event, should be the last match of the night, and definitely should just be it. And then throw your, let, Rashad Evans, basically, the ending of the pay-per-view should have been him celebrating, them then doing their recap, and then them doing, their last little video package. That should have been the end of the pay-per-view, not, okay, we're going to show you more matches now. I just don't think that works. I don't think I just don't think it works. That's just my opinion. A lot of people probably say I'm wrong, and that's fine. But that was what I was trying to put at. Now, why do I keep bitching about this? Well, here's why. Because at some point, because it happens to every sport, you ride a high, which UFC is definitely riding right now. They are hot. They're making money. I would say you look at this pay-per-view. We probably will not see a pay-per-view with a card this good again for a long time. Why? Because UFC doesn't need to do it. Mir versus Lesnar could go out there. They could put on a crappy undercard, and that'll probably do 1 million buys. So there's no reason for them to go out and continually put on cards like that, which is unfortunate because it's one of the things people really gripe about, that UFC doesn't put enough big cards together per se, and I think UFC sees that as, well, that's our big problem. So once, when we hit that level to where our popularity starts waning, all we got to do is just start putting on these bigger cards, and we'll be able to, keep that popularity up. And while I think that's part of it, I think the other part of it is they do have to, kind of accept the entertainment factor just a little bit more. I'm not saying they have to go full-heartedly. I'm not saying they have to do like the first Elite XC show. I'm not saying that. But, maybe somewhere in between wouldn't be so bad. Like I said, every major sport goes through that. And the best example I could use would be the NBA. During the Jordan era, the NBA was flying high, going great. Except that a lot of, at the time, people said, basketball purists were griping because they said that with the rule changes that they had implemented, and they did change the rules, not a bunch, but they tweaked the rules so that, I'm not saying Michael Jordan, before we get into that whole debate, I'm a big basketball fan, by the way, but they tweaked the rules so that players like Jordan could be more dominant because they thought that is what the fans wanted to see. The problem was that a lot of purists and historians all said that, well, that's fine and great, but what are you going to do when you have the next generation of players come up who, because you've tweaked these rules, they're going to be taught to play within those rules, aren't going to have the fundamentals. Their fundamentals are basically going to erode away. And that's exactly what happened. And so once that era, the Jordan era guys left, the guys just were not as good because they weren't as fundamentally sound. Now it has run its course, and now I think you're back to where guys are just as good. And part of that is because of the influx of foreign players who were better fundamentally than a lot of the American players. But it was a problem within the NBA, and some people say it's still a problem with the NBA, with the fact that Stern Stern has this attitude of, we're growing, we're doing good, but he's not looking at the game, which is the foundation of his sport, okay, and seeing the problems within that. The inconsistency with refs and all of that. There are a lot of these issues which they have not addressed over the years, which eventually came back to bite them in the butt. And that's the type of thing that I'm talking about with the UFC. I'm not saying that the UFC has to do this or they're going to die or whatever. I'm not saying anything like that. But they're just things that I see that they could improve on. And I think they do need to improve on, because I think you have to stay ahead of the curve. when it comes to stuff like this. Because if you look at the NFL, which always does seem to try to stay ahead of the curve, more than any sport, I would say around the world, even more than FIFA does with soccer, always trying to stay ahead of the curve on both what's on the field, off the field, teams, all of that sort of thing. They always seemingly try to stay as far ahead as the curve as they can, and they benefited from it because that's why they're as big as they are. That's why the NFL is the big monster juggernaut that they are in sports. So that is why I have the problems that I do when it comes to the timing issues, them putting the undercard matches on. Not so much them putting them on, but just how they put them on. Instead of, I think, putting on better and longer hype packages and that sort of thing. That's what I was trying to get at. I probably, and I just, as I said, I've been talking about this for a long time, and I didn't want to talk about that for a long time on that video. Now, to the second part of this video, which is, one thing I noticed during the Nogueira fight, the Mir Nogueira fight, is the fact that, and a lot of people noted this particularly during the hype show for this pay-per-view, was the fact that Fedor was not mentioned at all when it came to Nogueira, which a lot of people thought was a bit, that's a bit understandable, but still a bit odd, because his two fights with Fedor are two of his most important fights. And even though Fedor is not one of your fighters and he's fighting for a rival promotion, no one really saw it as a bad thing to bring up the fact that he has been in these wars, particularly with Fedor. And the fact that, which became a big issue because Mir stopped him, that not even Fedor was able to stop him. And particularly during the fight, when Joe Rogan was talking about the fact of how tough and how many wars that Nog had been through, he brought up all these guys. He brought up Bob Sapp, he brought up Krokop, he brought up all of these people, and then finally, when he was like, okay, I'm sorry, but I have to bring it up, he brought up the two Fedor fights, but just in passing, and to me that was a bit just odd, particularly since Rogan seemed like, he was very conscious not to bring up Fedor, and I think that is kind of a bad thing. Not a big bad thing, but I do think that you do have to kind of let your announcers talk about guys' past. And if those pasts mean that, hey, they took on a guy that's not in your organization anymore, but that was an important fight, you bring it up. You bring up the fact that, hey, Fedor has beaten this guy twice, this is how Fedor beat him. Most people figured there was no way Mir would be able to beat him the same way, and bring that. I don't think that's putting over Fedor. I don't think that's putting over the competition. That's simply just talking about a guy's history, and that's just my take on that. That was something I noticed. I wanted to talk about that last night, and I just didn't get the chance. But being the Fedor mark that I am. But anyways, that is this vid. As I said, there will be the next vid will be a wrestling vid. It will be the WWE rant vid, since so many people asked about it. Like I said, it will not be as passionate. I can pretty much tell you right off the bat, but that's pretty much how it's going to be. But anyways, I'm done. I'm out. Later. Have a good one.